The Arizona Territory bred its share of legendary gunslingers during the tumultuous years following the Civil War. Men like Lightning Jack Harrison, the infamous Clayton brothers, and the ruthless Eduardo El Coyote Vasquez. But perhaps none left a more intriguing legacy than Sarah Angel Eyes McPherson, a woman whose very name would later send chills down the spines of even the most hardened outlaws. A quiet widow whose piercing blue eyes could read a man's soul, and whose six-shooter spoke only in whispers of lead and gunsmoke. Once coldly stated, men mistake kindness for weakness until kindness holds a gun. Join me today as we delve into the extraordinary tale of the woman they called Angel Eyes, the guardian widow of Shadow Creek Valley, who proved that the deadliest predator might just be the one serving you apple pie and tea. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special lined up for you. Shadow Creek, Arizona Territory, spring of 1875. The town was like many others scattered across the frontier. A dusty main street, lined with sun-bleached buildings where hope and desperation danced together beneath the merciless desert sun. It was the kind of place where most folks minded their own business, which is exactly why Sarah McPherson chose it. She arrived on a cool March morning, driving a wagon loaded with modest furnishings, her black morning dress catching the desert wind. Those who witnessed her arrival would later recall two things: the wedding ring she still wore on a chain around her neck, and the fact that her smile, though warm, never quite reached those haunting blue eyes. The townsfolk of Shadow Creek were used to widows seeking fresh starts in the territory, but something about Sarah McPherson was different. She carried herself with a quiet grace that some mistook for fragility, an assumption that would prove fatal for some. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a veteran lawman who'd buried his share of both good men and bad, watched the newcomer from his office porch. "There's two kinds of folks who come to the territory," he'd later write in his journal, "those running from something and those running towards something. Mrs. McPherson struck me as both. Dr. Mary Wilson was the first to actually befriend the mysterious widow, treating her for what Sarah claimed was a burn from her cooking stove. The doctor couldn't help but notice the calluses on her hands, not the typical marks of a homemaker, but the kind that came from regular handling of rope and leather. More telling were the faint scars across her knuckles, the type that spoke of violence rather than domestic accidents. But Wilson was a woman who understood discretion, and the questions she didn't ask spoke volumes about the respect Sarah quickly earned in the community. Within a week, Sarah had purchased the old Anderson place, a modest house with a small orchard, on the outskirts of town. The previous owner, a failed farmer who'd lost his dream to drought and debt, had been all too eager to sell. She paid in gold double eagles, each coin gleaming like her mysterious eyes in the desert sun. "There's something about this place," she told Rebecca Cooper, the local general store owner, as she bought supplies for repairs. "Something that feels like home." She wasn't wrong about finding home, though she couldn't have imagined just how fiercely she would soon have to defend it. The widow settled into her new property with methodical precision. She tended the struggling apple trees, repaired the fence lines, and started keeping chickens. She paid her bills promptly, attended Sunday services, though she never sang with the congregation, and politely declined invitations to social gatherings. When spoken to, she responded with soft-spoken courtesy and that never-quite-reaching-her-eyes smile, earning her the local nickname Gentle Mrs. McPherson. Rebecca Cooper, whose store served as the town's unofficial gathering place, noticed peculiar details about their new neighbors' shopping habits. She always bought ammunition in bulk, explaining it away as protection against coyotes. Her eyes would linger on wanted posters, though she never commented on them, and she had an uncanny habit of positioning herself with her back to the wall, keeping the door in sight at all times. As spring bloomed in Shadow Creek, no one suspected that the quiet widow with the haunting eyes was anything more than she appeared. No one knew that her gentle hands had once been feared throughout the Kansas Territory, or that her apple pies had once been served to some of the most dangerous men in the West, right before she sent them to meet their maker. But that was about to change. The Kincaid gang was riding toward Shadow Creek, and with them came the storm that would shatter the silence surrounding Sarah Angel Eyes McPherson forever. The air grew thick with tension as the Kincaid gang's reputation rode into Shadow Creek ahead of them. Tales of their brutality had already reached the town through whispered conversations and desperate telegrams. Stories of burned homesteads, ruthless robberies, and widows who weren't allowed to remain widows for long. Sheriff Bradley had seen enough trouble in his 15 years wearing the badge to know when a storm was brewing. In her store, Rebecca Cooper watched Sarah McPherson examine the latest wanted posters with that same quiet intensity she brought to everything. The widow's eyes lingered on one in particular, a sketch of James Kincaid himself, with a reward of $1,000 listed beneath his cruel features. "Terrible business," Rebecca commented, trying to draw her friend into conversation. "They say the Kincaids are headed this way, 3 brothers and their gang, maybe 15 men in all." Sarah's response was characteristic in its briefness, but something in her tone made Rebecca pause. "Some men mistake the territory for lawless," the widow said softly, carefully refolding her purchased fabric. "They forget that law and justice aren't always the same thing." That same afternoon, Dr. Mary Wilson made an unexpected house call to the Anderson place, finding Sarah in her garden. The apple trees were beginning to show signs of life under her careful tending. "Town councils meeting tonight," the doctor said without preamble, "to discuss the Kincaid situation. Sheriff Bradley's organizing volunteers for a militia." Sarah continued pruning her trees, her movements precise and methodical. "Good men with good intentions," she replied, "but good intentions don't stop bullets." "Then what does?" Mary asked, watching her friend's hands move with surprising skill along the branches. For just a moment, something flickered in those blue eyes, something cold and deadly as a rattlesnake's gaze. "Experience," Sarah answered softly. Then the moment passed, and she was once again just a widow tending her orchard. The doctor wasn't the only visitor that day. As evening approached, Sheriff Bradley himself rode out to the Anderson place. He found Sarah on her porch, a cup of tea cooling beside her as she worked on what appeared to be mending. But the sheriff's veteran eyes noticed something odd about the fabric in her lap. It was a gun belt, being carefully oiled and maintained with professional precision. "Mrs. McPherson," he said, remaining mounted as courtesy dictated when calling. "On a lone woman. Might have some trouble coming to town. Thought you should be warned." "Kind of you, Sheriff," she replied, her hands never pausing in their work. "But I learned long ago that trouble comes whether we're warned or not. Best we can do is be prepared." Something about her words, about the way her hands moved across the leather, triggered a memory in Bradley's mind. 5 years ago, he'd heard stories from Kansas about another widow, one who'd taken in 3 men from the notorious Harper gang, offering them shelter from a storm. They'd been found the next morning, all 3 dead in their beds, their guns still in their holsters. The woman had vanished, leaving only cooling cups of tea and 3 perfectly tied nooses. As the sun began to set over Shadow Creek, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, more rumors arrived via telegraph. The Kincaids had hit a stagecoach, stationed 30 miles east, leaving no survivors. They were moving west, marking their trail with violence and terror. In town, the council meeting devolved into near panic as each new report arrived. But out at the Anderson place, Sarah McPherson calmly served tea to young Deputy William Hayes, who'd ridden out to check on her welfare. "Ma'am," he said, watching her pour with perfect poise, "maybe you should consider staying in town until this blows over. Sheriff Bradley's offering space in the jail for folks who live outside town limits." Sarah's smile was gentle, but those eyes, those angel eyes that seemed to see right through a man, held something that made the deputy's hand tremble slightly as he reached for his cup. "That's very kind," she replied, "but my husband always said a person should face their troubles at home." She paused, glancing out her window at the approaching dusk. "Besides, Deputy Hayes, I have a feeling the Kincaid gang might just find more trouble than they're looking for in Shadow Creek." The writing of this story took considerable effort, so if you're enjoying it, please subscribe to our channel. It means the world to us. Now, back to our tale of the widow who was more than she seemed. Dawn broke over Shadow Creek with an eerie calm, the kind of stillness that makes veteran lawmen check their ammunition twice. Sheriff Bradley stood on his office porch, watching the sun paint the desert gold, while Deputy Hayes delivered his morning report about the outlying homesteads. "Everyone's either left or barricaded themselves in," the young deputy said, dark, circles under his eyes betraying his sleepless night. "Except for Mrs. McPherson. She's still out there, calm as Sunday morning, baking pies of all things. Could smell them clear from the road." Bradley's weathered face creased with concern. "That woman," he muttered, "there's something about her we're missing." He turned to his deputy. "Tell me again about Kansas." Hayes shuffled through his notes. The telegrams had been arriving all night, each one adding pieces to a puzzle that made less and less sense. 5 years back, a widow named Sarah Hawkins took in 3 men from the Harper gang. Next morning, all 3 dead. Wire from Dodge City mentions similar incidents. Jefferson County, 2 members of the Booth gang found at a farmhouse, cups of tea still warm. Topeka, 4 men from the Richardson outfit, same story. Always a widow, always vanished after. "Different names?" Bradley asked, though he already knew the answer. "Sarah Hawkins, Sarah Collins, Sarah Miller. Always Sarah, always a widow, always moving west. But after Topeka, the trail goes cold until Sarah McPherson rides into Shadow Creek," Bradley finished, watching the dust devils dance down the empty street. At the general store, Rebecca Cooper was organizing her shelves when Dr. Wilson burst in, her usual composure shaken. "You need to see this," the doctor said, pulling a worn newspaper from her bag. It was yellowed with age, dated 3 years back from a small Kansas town. The headline read, "Widow's Justice, the Legend of the Angel-Eyed Avenger." Rebecca scanned the article, her eyes widening. "It can't be," she whispered. "Our Sarah." The story told of a woman whose husband, a prominent lawman, had been murdered by outlaws while defending a stagecoach line. Instead of fading into grief, his widow had turned vigilante, using her beauty and seeming vulnerability to lure dangerous men to justice. Her calling card became a cup of tea and those unforgettable blue eyes, the last things her victims would see. "There's more," Mary Wilson added, pulling out more clippings. "They called her Angel Eyes, said she could look into a man's soul and judge his sins. The bounty hunters couldn't catch her, the gangs couldn't stop her. She was a ghost. A legend until she just disappeared." Outside, the wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering down the street like harbingers of the coming storm. At her farm, Sarah McPherson stood in her kitchen, the scent of fresh-baked apple pie filling the air. Her movements were precise and methodical as she cleaned her counters, but her eyes kept drifting to a loose floorboard beneath her rocking chair. The sound of approaching hooves made her pause. Through her window she saw young Tommy Burke, the blacksmith's son, riding hard toward her property. His face was flushed with exertion and fear as he reined up by her gate. "Mrs. McPherson!" he called out, his voice cracking. Sheriff Bradley sent me. The Kincaids. They've been spotted at Eagle's Pass. Maybe 20 men now, all armed. They'll be here by nightfall. Sarah wiped her hands calmly on her apron. Thank you, Tommy, she called back. Would you like a piece of pie before you ride? Back? The boy shook his head, already turning his horse. No time, ma'am. Sheriff says you need to come to town now. She watched him gallop away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Only then did her gentle smile fade, replaced by something harder, colder, an expression that would have made even the bravest man step back. Moving with deliberate grace, she knelt and lifted the loose floorboard. Inside was a wooden box, well-oiled and carefully maintained. When she opened it, the desert sun caught the blued steel of two matching Colt peacemakers, their ivory grips yellowed with age, but their barrels gleaming like new. Beside them lay a gun belt, the leather dark with years of use and precisely positioned, holsters worn smooth by countless drawers. Well, Thomas, she whispered, touching the wedding ring at her throat, looks like our past is finally catching up to us. In the gathering heat of midday, James Kincaid sat atop his black stallion at Eagle's Pass, studying the distant shapes of Shadow Creek through his brass spyglass. Behind him, his men rested their horses in whatever shade they could find, their faces hard and cruel beneath sweat-stained hats. The Kincaid brothers, James, Matthew, and young Luke, had built their reputation on ruthless efficiency and an absolute lack of mercy. Town looks soft, Matthew observed, pulling alongside his older brother. One sheriff, maybe one deputy, could be in and out before sundown. James lowered his spyglass, his face creasing into a predatory smile. No rush, little brother. I want them to know we're coming. Fear's always been our best weapon. He turned to address the gang, his voice carrying across the rocky terrain. Boys, we're going to take our time with this one. By nightfall, I want every soul in Shadow Creek shaking at the mere mention of the Kincaid name. Back in town, Sheriff Bradley was organizing the defense with grim determination. He'd positioned men on rooftops, arranged ammunition caches, and evacuated the most vulnerable citizens to the stone-walled church basement. But his thoughts kept returning to Sarah McPherson and those newspaper clippings. "You're sure about this?" he asked Dr. Wilson, who'd brought him the latest bits of information she and Rebecca had pieced together. "The descriptions match," Mary replied, spreading the articles across his desk. "The eyes, the technique, even the tea, but there's something else." She pulled out a final clipping, this one from a law enforcement bulletin. Her husband wasn't just any lawman. Thomas McPherson was a legend in Kansas. They called him Deadeye. McPherson said he could shoot the flame off a candle at 50 paces. Bradley's face showed dawning recognition. "I remember hearing about him. Killed defending a stagecoach, wasn't he?" "By the Harper gang," Mary confirmed, "and within a month 3 of them turned up dead in a widow's house. That's when the legend of Angel Eyes began." At the Anderson place, Sarah moved through her house with practiced efficiency, making preparations that seemed oddly domestic on the surface. She baked more pies, set her table with her best china, and laid out her finest tablecloth. But beneath the everyday facade, other preparations were being made. The heavy kitchen table was subtly repositioned to provide cover. Thick curtains were hung to control sight lines through windows. And in various, seemingly innocent locations throughout the house, weapons were concealed within easy reach. A derringer beneath a flower vase, a shotgun behind the pantry door, her matched Colts within. The folds of her full skirt, Rebecca Cooper arrived, just as Sarah was adding final touches to her preparations. The storekeeper had insisted on bringing extra supplies, though her real purpose was obvious in her concerned expression. "The whole town's talking," Rebecca said without preamble. "About Kansas, about the Harper gang, about you," Sarah continued, arranging teacups with delicate precision. "People always talk, Rebecca, especially when they're afraid." "Are you? Afraid, I mean." Sarah paused, those remarkable blue eyes reflecting the afternoon light like steel. Fear's a luxury I gave up a long time ago. The night Thomas died, I learned something. There are worse things than fear, like watching good people suffer while evil men prosper. The sheriff could post men here, protect you, Rebecca offered. No, Sarah's voice was soft but firm. The town needs them more. Besides, she added, checking the placement of a teaspoon, I've found that men like the Kincaids tend to underestimate a widow serving tea. As Rebecca rode back to town, she glanced over her shoulder at the Anderson place. In the dying light, it looked almost peaceful. The neat white house, the budding apple trees, the smoke curling from the chimney. Only someone who looked closely would notice how the angles of approach were subtly blocked, how the windows caught the light in ways that would blind anyone looking in, how the whole property had been arranged like a web with the widow's house at its center. In Eagles Pass, James Kincaid was giving final instructions to his men. Remember, boys, we take the town first, nice and slow, let them feel the terror build. Then, once night falls, we visit every farm and homestead in the valley. I want examples made. Young Luke Kincaid, eager to prove himself, spoke up. What about that widow's place? The one Tommy Burke spotted on his scout. James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, we'll save the widow for last. Might even keep her around a while. Been a long time since we had a woman's touch in our camp. None of them noticed the solitary hawk circling overhead, or how its shadow seemed to mark them like targets in the desert sun. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Shadow Creek, Sheriff Bradley made one final attempt to convince Sarah to abandon her homestead. He found her in her kitchen, the aroma of fresh-baked pies mixing incongruously with the tension in the air. Mrs. McPherson, he said, hat in hand at her door, I know who you are, who you really are. Sarah continued, wiping her dishes with methodical precision. Does that change anything, Sheriff? It changes everything. The Kincaids, they're different from the others. 20 men, all killers. You can't face them alone. She placed the last dish in its place before turning to face him, those haunting blue eyes seeming to peer into his soul. I've never been alone, Sheriff. Thomas is always with me. Her hand touched the wedding ring at her throat. And the dead, well, they have a way of making sure justice finds its mark. In town, Dr. Wilson was preparing her clinic for what she feared would be a long night. Rebecca Cooper helped her organize bandages and medicines, both women working in tense silence until Rebecca finally spoke. I read more about Kansas, she said softly. About what happened after Thomas McPherson died. They say she didn't just kill those men, she gave them a chance to repent first, served them tea, listened to their confessions. Mary nodded grimly. And those who showed true remorse were found tied up outside the nearest jail. But the others, Rebecca shuddered. They say she was merciful, though. Quick, clean kills, more than they deserved. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first hints of evening's chill. Deputy Hayes, making his final rounds, noted how the townspeople had battened down for the coming storm. Doors were barred, windows shuttered, weapons loaded and primed. But his eyes kept straying to the road, leading to the Anderson place, where a single thread of smoke still rose peacefully from the chimney. At Eagles Pass, the Kincaid gang made their final preparations. James Kincaid gathered his lieutenants, laying out their plan of attack. Pete, you take 5 men and hit them from the north. Matthew, same from the south. Luke, you're with me. We'll lead the main force straight down their throat. What about the widow? Luke asked, young face eager for violence. Like I said, boy, we saved the best for last. James's smile was cold as a rattler's gaze. Nothing sweeter than a woman's hospitality, especially when she's got no choice about offering it. As the sun began to set, Sarah McPherson stood at her window, watching the changing light paint the desert in shades of blood and gold. She'd changed from her usual black dress into a deep blue gown that matched her eyes. her greying hair neatly pinned up as if preparing for guests. The wooden box lay open on her bed, its contents now carefully distributed about her person. The weight of the Colts beneath her skirt was as familiar as an old friend's embrace. Thomas had taught her well, not just how to shoot, but how to read men's souls through their eyes, how to see the darkness lurking behind their smiles. "You were right, my love," she whispered to the gathering dusk. "Evil men mistake kindness for weakness. They never understand that mercy and justice can come from the same hand." A rider appeared on the horizon. Tommy Burke again, his horse lathered with foam. "Mrs. McPherson," he shouted, reining up at her gate. "They're coming. Sheriff Bradley says it's all right, Tommy," she called back, her voice gentle as a mother's lullaby. "You've done your duty. Now ride back to town and tell the sheriff not to worry about me. Tell him—" She paused, a slight smile touching her lips. "Tell him I'm about to serve tea." The boy hesitated only a moment before galloping away. Sarah watched him go, then turned back to her preparations. The table was set, the tea was steeping, and the pies were cooling on the windowsill. Everything was ready. In the distance, dust. Clouds marked the approach of riders, their silhouettes dark against the setting sun. Night fell over Shadow Creek like a velvet curtain, bringing with it an unnatural stillness. Even the coyotes seemed to sense the approaching violence, their usual evening chorus conspicuously absent. Sheriff Bradley stood in his office with Deputy Hayes, both men watching the darkness through grimy windows. "Shouldn't we try one more time to bring her in?" Hayes asked, his young face etched with concern. Bradley shook his head slowly. "Some folks, William, you don't save. Some folks do the saving." He checked his pocket watch in the lamplight. "And if those Kansas stories are true, the Kincaids don't know it yet, but they're riding straight into the jaws of a trap." The first riders hit town like a summer storm, hard, fast, and with devastating effect. Pete's group from the north, 5 men strong, shot out the street lamps one by one. Matthew Kincaid's southern contingent methodically took up positions, covering the main approaches. In the chaos, none of them noticed the shadows moving between buildings. Townspeople who'd been drilled by Deputy Hayes, quietly implementing Bradley's defensive strategy. James Kincaid and his main force waited just outside town, watching the initial stages of their plan unfold. Young Luke fidgeted in his saddle, eager to join the action. "Why are we waiting, James? Town's ripe for the taking." "Patience, little brother," James replied, his voice carrying that edge of cruel amusement that had become his trademark. "Let them feel the fear build. By the time we ride in, they'll be begging to give us everything they own." At the Anderson place, Sarah McPherson moved through her house with practiced efficiency, checking each window and door one final time. The teapot sat ready on the stove, her best china laid out as if for honored guests. But beneath the domestic facade, other preparations were complete. She'd positioned furniture to create subtle barriers, arranged mirrors to catch and redirect lamplight, and carefully measured the steps between each potential point of cover. Through her window, she caught movement at the edge of her property. 3 riders moving cautiously through her apple orchard. They were trying to be quiet, but to Sarah's trained ear, their approach was as loud as a cattle drive. 3 men, Thomas," she whispered, touching the ring at her throat. "Just like that night in Kansas." Her hand dropped to the comfort of her hidden Colt. "Let's hope these show more remorse than the Harper boys did." In town, Dr. Wilson and Rebecca Cooper had transformed the clinic's back room into an impromptu command center. Through careful positioning of mirrors in upper windows, they could track the movements of Kincaid's men and relay information through a network of messengers, mostly children, who could move unseen in the darkness. "They're splitting their forces," Rebecca observed, watching the reflection of mounted men in her carefully angled mirror. "More than half the gang still holding back." Mary nodded grimly. "They're saving their strength for something, or someone." The three riders reached Sarah's front gate, their movements suggesting military experience, probably deserters from the Union Army, like so many outlaws in the territory. The leader, a scarred man with a cavalry mustache, dismounted first. "Evening, boys," Sarah called from her doorway, her voice carrying that gentle lilt that had disarmed so many before them. "You're out awful late." The men exchanged glances, obviously surprised by her calm demeanor. The scarred leader recovered first, touching his hat in mock courtesy. "Evening, ma'am. Hoping you might offer some hospitality to weary travelers." Sarah's smile was warm, though it never quite reached those angel eyes. "Why, of course. I just finished baking an apple pie, and the tea's almost ready. Won't you come in?" The men climbed her porch steps, boots heavy on the wooden boards. None of them noticed how she positioned herself to keep them all in view, or how her right hand stayed hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Mind if our friends join us later?" the leader asked, gesturing vaguely toward town. "Got quite a crew out tonight." "The more the merrier," Sarah replied softly, opening her door. "I always set a proper table for guests. My husband taught me that hospitality should be offered to all." She paused, those piercing eyes suddenly hard as steel, even those about to meet their judgment. "If you're finding yourself drawn into this tale of justice and vengeance, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life." Now, back to Shadow Creek, where the widow's deadly game was about to begin. The three men followed Sarah into her house, the scent of fresh-baked pie and brewing tea momentarily masking their violent intentions. She'd positioned the lamps perfectly, enough light to see by, but carefully arranged to keep her guests at a subtle disadvantage. "Make yourselves comfortable." She gestured to the kitchen table, her movements graceful and unhurried. "Though, I'd appreciate if you'd leave your gun belts by the door. My husband was quite particular about weapons at the dinner table." The scarred leader, who introduced himself as Clayton, smirked at his companions. "Don't mind if we keep them, ma'am. Dangerous times, after all." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly, turning to fetch the teapot. "They certainly are." In town, the initial phase of the Kincaid gang's attack was meeting unexpected resistance. Pete's men found themselves pinned down by surprisingly accurate fire from the upper floors of the general store. Matthew Kincaid's southern force walked into a prepared crossfire between the livery stable and the blacksmith's shop. "Something's wrong," Matthew shouted to his lieutenant. "These ain't scared townfolk shooting, these are planned fields of fire." Back at the Anderson place, Sarah poured tea with steady hands, her every movement calculated and precise. She'd positioned herself so that the lamplight caught her wedding ring, making it glint like a signal fire. "Beautiful piece," Clayton observed, nodding toward the ring. "Your husband must have been a man of means." "He was a man of principle," Sarah corrected, her blue eyes suddenly sharp as razor wire, something this territory seems to lack these days. The youngest of the three outlaws, barely more than a boy, shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Ma'am," he started, "about what's coming. You might want to—" "Shut up, Billy," Clayton snapped. But Sarah was already focusing those penetrating eyes on the young man. "About what's coming?" she asked gently. "You mean James Kincaid and his brothers? The 20-odd men currently attacking my town?" She smiled at their shocked expressions. "Oh yes, I know all about them, just like I knew about you three. Tell me, does Kincaid take all his advance scouts from the 3rd Cavalry, or just the deserters?" Clayton's hand dropped to his gun, but Sarah's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't," she said softly. "You'd be dead before you cleared leather. Ask me how I know." At the edge of town, James Kincaid was losing patience. The sporadic gunfire from the initial assault had taken on a pattern he didn't like. "Luke," he commanded his younger brother, "ride up to the widow's place, see what's keeping Clayton and his boys." In Sarah's kitchen, the tension had reached a breaking point. Clayton's face was a mask of confused fury as he studied their hostess. "Who are you, lady?" "Just a widow," Sarah replied, her hand hidden beneath her skirt, "though your friend Billy there seems to have a conscience. That's rare in your line of work." She focused those angel eyes on the young outlaw. "Last chance. Billy, walk away now, turn yourself into Sheriff Bradley, and I'll speak for you at your trial." "You're bluffing," Clayton snarled, starting to rise. "Three of us, one of you, and—" The movement beneath Sarah's skirt was too fast to follow. Her first shot took Clayton in the chest before he could stand fully upright. The second man died, reaching for his pistol, but her gun never trained on Billy, who sat frozen, hands flat on the table. "Choose quickly, boy," she said quietly, her Colt now visible, but not aimed at him. "My husband used to say every man gets one chance at redemption. This is yours." Outside, Luke Kincaid heard the shots and spurred his horse toward the Anderson place, unaware that he was riding straight toward a legend that had already claimed dozens of souls across the Kansas territory. The widow's reckoning had begun. Billy made his choice in the space of a heartbeat, raising his hands slowly from the table. "I surrender, ma'am. Had enough of killing anyway." Sarah nodded approvingly, though her Colt never wavered. "Cellar doors behind you. There's rope on the shelf. You'll tie yourself up and wait there. Sheriff Bradley will collect you in the morning." Her eyes softened slightly. "Make the most of your second chance, boy. Not everyone gets one." As Billy disappeared into the cellar, Sarah moved. With practiced efficiency, she dragged Clayton's body behind an overturned table, good cover for what was coming. The second man she positioned near the window, a grim message for the approaching riders. Throughout it all, her movements were precise, tactical, like a chess player arranging pieces for the next gambit. In town, the tide was turning against the Kincaid gang's advance teams. Pete's men had lost two of their own, trying to dislodge the defenders from the general store. Matthew Kincaid found his southern approach completely blocked by interlocking fields of fire. "These ain't just townspeople," Matthew shouted into the darkness. "Someone's trained them." He was right. Deputy Hayes had spent weeks drilling with selected citizens, using techniques Sarah had quietly suggested during seemingly casual conversations. The town's defense was a deadly blend of local knowledge and professional expertise. Luke Kincaid reached the edge of Sarah's property just as she finished her preparations. He spotted the body in the window and immediately wheeled his horse around, but not before Sarah's voice carried across the yard. "Tell your brother I'm ready for his visit, boy. Tell him Angel Eyes is waiting." Luke's face went pale in the moonlight. He'd heard the stories, whispered around campfires, the avenging widow from Kansas, the ghost that hunted wicked men. He spurred his horse hard, riding back to his brother with news that would change everything. James Kincaid was already angry when Luke returned. The town's resistance had disrupted his carefully laid plans, and now his youngest brothers panicked. Report pushed him toward rage. "Angel Eyes?" he snarled, grabbing Luke's shirt front. "You're sure that's what she said?" "It's her, James," Luke stammered. "Clayton and Mike are dead. She was waiting for them." James released his brother, his mind racing. The legend of Angel Eyes was well known in certain circles. A widow who'd turned vengeance into an art form, who'd systematically hunted down every man responsible for her husband's death. But she was supposed to be just that, a legend. "Change of plans," he announced to his remaining men. "Matt, pull your boys back. Pete, fall back to the ridge. We're going to pay this widow a personal visit." Sarah watched their movements through her carefully positioned mirrors. She'd anticipated this reaction. Men like James Kincaid couldn't resist a challenge to their authority, especially from a woman. Her trap was working perfectly. Dr. Wilson, observing from her clinic window, saw the gang regrouping. "They're pulling back," she reported to Sheriff Bradley. "All of them." "Not back," Bradley corrected grimly. "They're heading for the Anderson place." He checked his ammunition with practiced hands. Time to move to the next phase. Sarah sat calmly in her kitchen, the bodies of her would-be killers, arranged like props in a grim theatre. In the cellar, Billy listened to her quiet movements above, wondering how he'd ever thought her just another helpless widow. 13 men left, Thomas, she whispered to the growing darkness, touching the ring at her throat. More than usual, but then you always said I worked best under pressure. She checked her Colts one final time, their familiar weight comforting beneath her skirt. The teapot was ready for the next round of visitors, though she doubted James Kincaid would accept her hospitality as easily as Clayton had. The moon emerged from behind a cloud, casting long shadows across her property. In the distance, horses approached. Many horses. Sarah smiled, and in that expression was nothing of the gentle widow. It was the smile of a predator, patient and precise, waiting for prey to enter her carefully laid trap. James Kincaid arranged his men in a wide circle around the Anderson place, their horses moving quietly in the desert night. The moon cast enough light to see the widow's house clearly, peaceful, almost idyllic, with lamplight glowing warmly. Through the windows and smoke still curling from the chimney. Remember, he instructed his men, she may look like a simple widow, but she's already killed Clayton and Mike. Nobody takes shots unless I give the word. I want her alive to answer for that. Inside, Sarah moved like a ghost through her home, extinguishing lamps one by one, until only a single light remained in the kitchen. Years of experience had taught her how to use darkness as a weapon, how to make shadows work to her advantage. Through her carefully arranged mirrors, she tracked the outlaws' positions. They were good, she had to admit, spreading out to cover. All approaches using the apple trees for cover, but they were still thinking like soldiers, expecting a frontal defense. They hadn't yet realized that her entire property was the weapon. Widow McPherson, James Kincaid's voice boomed across the yard. Come on out, let's discuss this like civilized folks. Sarah's response was soft, yet somehow carried to every ear. Why don't you come in, Mr. Kincaid? The tea's still hot, and I've got plenty of pie left. In town, Sheriff Bradley led a select group of men toward the Anderson place, moving carefully through the arroyos and dried creek beds. Deputy Hayes had drilled them in this approach for weeks, though none had known exactly why until now. Stay in the shadows, Bradley whispered. She'll have them focused on the house. We're her surprise for later. Dr. Wilson and Rebecca watched the men go, then returned to their own preparations. The clinic was ready for casualties, though Mary privately hoped most of them would be from the Kincaid gang rather than the town's defenders. At the house, James Kincaid was losing patience. Maybe I didn't make myself clear, he shouted, anger edging his voice. You killed 2 of my men. Nobody does that and lives to tell about it. 3 of your men, Sarah corrected calmly, though technically I only killed 2. Young Billy chose a different path. Rather brave of him, don't you think? Luke Kincaid shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. There was something about her voice, something that made him want to follow Billy's example and run, but James's next words froze him in place. I know who you are. Angel Eyes, James called out. Been hearing stories about you since Kansas. Tell me, how many men have you murdered while playing the grieving widow? Murdered? Sarah's voice took on an edge like steel. No, Mr. Kincaid. Murder is what men like you do, killing innocents for profit and pleasure. What I do is justice. Ask the Harper gang about the difference. Oh, wait! Her quiet laugh carried across the yard. You can't. They're all dead. Matthew Kincaid, watching through his rifle scope, caught a glimpse of movement near the kitchen window. I got her in my sights, James. Hold your fire, James commanded. Something ain't right. She's too calm. He was correct to be suspicious. Sarah had positioned a dress on a stand near the window, using the mirror's reflection to make it appear occupied. Meanwhile, she'd moved to her prepared position upstairs, where she could observe the entire property. Last chance, Mr. Kincaid, she called out. Leave now, never return, and we can avoid adding to the body count. Stay and you'll Learn why they really call me Angel Eyes? Why's that, widow? James sneered, though a touch of uncertainty had crept into his voice. Because I see into men's souls, she replied softly. And I've judged yours wanting. The tension stretched like a drawn bowstring. In the distance, Sheriff Bradley and his men were nearly in position. In town, the remaining citizens watched and waited, and in her darkened house, Sarah McPherson, the legendary Angel Eyes, prepared to add new chapters to her legend. The real battle for Shadow Creek was about to begin. The first shot came from Matthew Kincaid, his patience finally breaking. The bullet shattered the kitchen window, splintering the wooden frame where Sarah's decoy dress had been moments before. In the sudden silence that followed, her quiet laugh seemed to come from everywhere at once. Poor choice, Matthew. Her voice drifted through the darkness. Now the dance begins. Before James could shout new orders, two of his men fell from their saddles, taken down by shots so perfectly placed and timed they seemed to come from the same instant. No one had seen a muzzle flash, heard the distinctive report of a Colt, or caught any movement from the house. Scatter, James commanded, but Sarah had anticipated this. As his men broke formation, they triggered the trap she'd carefully laid throughout her property. Tripwires sent horses stumbling, pre-positioned. Mirrors caught and reflected the moonlight to blind riders at crucial moments, and the whole time, those precise shots kept coming. "She's one woman!" Matthew screamed in frustration, firing blindly at the upper windows. "How is she everywhere?" In the cellar, young Billy listened to the chaos above, understanding now why Sarah had positioned him there. The cellar wasn't just a prison. It was a shelter from what she'd planned for the others. Sheriff Bradley and his men reached their positions just as Sarah's defensive strategy fully unfolded. They watched in amazement as the legendary Angel Eyes systematically dismantled one of the territory's most notorious gangs. "Like watching an artist at work," Bradley whispered to his deputy. "Notice how she's herding them, driving them right where she wants them." He was right. Each shot, each triggered trap, wasn't just about casualties. Sarah was choreographing a deadly dance, forcing the Kincaid gang into increasingly vulnerable positions. Years of experience had taught her that men under fire become predictable, and she'd prepared for every likely reaction. Luke Kincaid, youngest of the brothers, broke first. "James!" he shouted, voice cracking with terror. "This ain't worth it! She's picking us apart!" "Nobody moves," James commanded. But his authority was crumbling. 3 more men had fallen to Sarah's precise shooting, and the rest were rapidly losing their nerve. They'd come expecting to terrorize a helpless widow. Instead, they'd ridden into a killing ground where every shadow held death. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos like a steel blade. "6 down, Mr. Kincaid. 7 if we count young Billy's change. Of heart, how many men are you willing to sacrifice to your pride?" Matthew, trying to circle behind the house, suddenly found himself caught in a crossfire. Sarah had positioned mirrors to create false muzzle flashes, making it impossible to tell which shots were real and which were reflections. He took a bullet in the shoulder, his own shot going wild. 8, Sarah counted calmly. "Though your brother Matthew might live if he gets medical attention soon. Dr. Wilson is quite skilled, I hear." James Kincaid felt control of the situation slipping away. His carefully planned raid had transformed into a nightmare where a single widow was systematically destroying his gang. Worse, he was beginning to understand the stories about her weren't just legend, they were warnings. "You can't kill all of us," he shouted, trying to locate her voice in the darkness. "I don't need to," Sarah replied softly. "Fear will do most of the work for me. Ask your men. Ask them if they can feel it yet. That cold certainty in their gut telling them they've walked into a trap they can't escape." As if to prove her point, 2 more riders broke ranks and spurred their horses toward the open desert. James's bullets followed them, but missed in the Darkness, the gang's legendary discipline, was unraveling thread by thread. "Your reputation's finished either way, James," Sarah called out. "The only question is how many more men die before you accept it. I can do this all night. Thomas taught me patience, along with marksmanship." In the distance, Sheriff Bradley gave the signal. The second phase of Sarah's trap was about to spring, and the Kincaid gang was perfectly positioned for it. Sheriff Bradley's men moved like shadows through the darkness, taking up their prepared positions around the Anderson place. Sarah had mapped out every angle, every approach during those long weeks of planning. Now, as her carefully orchestrated trap reached its climax, the lawman would ensure none of the Kincaid gang slipped through the net. James Kincaid sensed the noose tightening, but couldn't see it yet. His remaining men had clustered together for protection, exactly where Sarah wanted them. The night air was thick with tension, broken only by the occasional moan from Matthew, who was still bleeding from his shoulder wound. "You've got nowhere left to run, Mr. Kincaid," Sarah's voice drifted through the darkness. "Though I suspect running was never in your nature, too much pride for that." "Show yourself!" James roared, firing at a movement that turned out to be just wind in the apple. "Trees, face me like a real gunfighter." "A real gunfighter?" Sarah's quiet laugh held no humor. "Like you faced my husband's stagecoach? 20 men against 3 guards?" The sudden silence was deafening as James processed her words. "Oh yes, Mr. Kincaid. I know all about you. You were there that day in Kansas, weren't you? Not brave enough to do the killing yourself, but happy to profit from it." Luke Kincaid's head snapped toward his brother. "James, what's she talking about?" "She's playing games," James snarled, but there was new tension in his voice. "Trying to turn us against each other." "Tell him, James," Sarah pressed. "Tell your baby brother how you helped the Harper gang plan their raids, how you sold information about stagecoach routes, including the one my Thomas died defending." The revelation hit the remaining gang members like a physical blow. They'd all heard about the Harper gang's fate, how an avenging widow had hunted them down one by one. Now they understood why she'd been waiting in Shadow Creek, why her trap had been so perfectly laid. "You knew," Matthew gasped through his pain. "You knew who she was when we rode in here." "Shut up." James's authority was crumbling as his secrets emerged. "She's just a woman, one woman." "No, Mr. Kincaid." Sarah's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I'm justice. The same justice you've been running from since Kansas. How many other widows have you created? How many other lives have you destroyed from the shadows while letting others take the risks?" The first shot from Bradley's men took down one of the gang's horses, adding to the chaos. The outlaws' return fire was wild, undisciplined, revealing their positions to Sarah's waiting colts. 2 more men fell before they realized they were caught in a crossfire. "It's over, James." Sheriff Bradley's voice boomed from the darkness. "You're surrounded by deputies and townsmen. Throw down your weapons." But James Kincaid had passed the point of reason. With a howl of rage, he spurred his horse toward the house, firing wildly. Sarah's first shot took his horse from under him. He rolled clear of the falling animal, coming up with both guns drawn. "Where are you?" he screamed. "Show yourself, Angel." "Eyes. I'm right here, Mr. Kincaid." She seemed to materialize on the porch like a spirit, her blue dress replaced by fitted riding clothes, her graying hair pulled back severely from that unforgettable face. The twin colts at her hips caught the moonlight like strips of silver. "Thomas always said a man's true character shows in how he faces death," she observed quietly. "Will you face yours on your feet, or shall I shoot you down as you did him, without a chance to defend himself?" James's response was a lightning-fast draw that had earned him his reputation across 3 territories. But Sarah McPherson hadn't spent the years since her husband's death idle. Before his gun cleared leather, both her colts spoke as one. The legend of Angel Eyes was about to add its final chapter. James Kincaid's legendary speed wasn't enough. Sarah's bullets found their mark with surgical precision, one through his gun hand, the other through his shoulder, mirroring his brother Matthew's wound. His guns clattered to the dirt as he fell. To his knees, shock and disbelief warring on his face. "That's for Thomas," Sarah said softly, her Colt still trained on him with rock-steady hands. "Though he would have given you a cleaner death." The remaining gang members, seeing their legendary leader brought down so easily, threw down their weapons. Sheriff Bradley's men emerged from the shadows to take them into custody. Luke Kincaid surrendered without a fight, his young face aged. Years by the night's revelations. "You knew," he said to his brother, as Deputy Hayes handcuffed him. "All this time, you knew who she was, what we were riding into." James, blood seeping between his fingers as he clutched his wounded hand, could only stare at the woman who had systematically destroyed everything he'd built. Sarah McPherson stood on her porch like an avenging angel, the mother's warmth gone from her face, replaced by something ancient and implacable. "Your men will stand trial," she told him, her voice carrying to every ear. "Some may even survive, in prison. But you, James Kincaid, you're coming with me to Kansas. There's a rope waiting there with your name on it, right next to where they hanged the last of the Harper gang." Dr. Wilson arrived to tend the wounded, her face grim as she examined Matthew's shoulder. "He'll live," she announced, "though he may never shoot straight again." "Fitting," Sarah replied. "A reminder every time he tries to draw a gun of where that path leads." Rebecca Cooper, watching from the clinic doorway, saw something remarkable happening. As the deputies led away the prisoners, the townspeople began emerging from their homes. They gathered in small groups, watching Sarah with a mixture of awe and understanding. The gentle widow who had lived among them was gone, replaced by a figure of legend, yet somehow they weren't afraid. "You've known all along, haven't you?" Sheriff Bradley asked her, as his men secured the scene. "That Kincaid would eventually follow the rumors here?" Sarah nodded, finally holstering her Colts. "Set the bait in Kansas 6 months ago. Let it be known that Angel Eyes was retiring, looking for a quiet place to settle down. Men like James Kincaid can't resist a chance at revenge." She touched the wedding ring at her throat. "Thomas taught me that evil men always return to their old hunting grounds, thinking they're the predator when they're actually the prey." Young Billy, brought up from the cellar, looked at her with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "What happens to me now, Mom?" Sarah studied him for a long moment, those piercing eyes seeing straight to his soul. "You chose to step away from darkness, Billy. That counts for something." She turned to Sheriff Bradley. "If you're willing, Sheriff, the boy could use some guidance. Maybe a deputy's badge, once he's proven himself?" Bradley nodded, understanding her meaning. Sometimes redemption needed a firm hand to guide it. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Sarah stood in her kitchen, brewing a fresh pot of tea. The bodies had been removed, the blood washed from her porch, but something fundamental had changed in Shadow Creek. The legend of Angel Eyes was no longer just a story told around campfires. It was real, living and breathing among them. "Doctor," Wilson found her there, those remarkable blue eyes distant with memory. "Will you stay?" the doctor asked. "Now that everyone knows?" Sarah's smile held a warmth that had been absent during the night's violence. "This is home now," she said softly. "Thomas would have liked it here. A place worth protecting, people worth standing beside." Outside, the first rays of sunlight caught the apple blossoms in her orchard, turning them to fire and gold. Shadow Creek was waking to a new day, and a new understanding of the quiet widow who had chosen to make it her home. Word of the Kincaid gang's defeat spread through the territories like wildfire, growing with each telling. In saloons from Texas to Dakota Territory, men spoke in hushed tones about the widow who had single-handedly destroyed one of the most feared gangs in the West. Some said she could shoot the flame off a match at 50 paces. Others claimed she could read a man's sins in his eyes. All agreed on one thing. Shadow Creek was now under the protection of a living legend. The trial was brief but memorable. James Kincaid, his hand still bandaged, sat in chains as witness after witness testified about his gang's reign of terror. But it was Sarah's testimony that sealed his fate. She spoke for 3 hours, methodically laying out his connection to every stage robbery, every murder, every act of violence, stretching back to Kansas. Her voice never rose above a gentle conversation tone, but her words carried the weight of years of careful investigation. Thomas believed in the law, she told the packed courthouse. Even at the end, facing overwhelming odds, he died defending it. The least I could do was ensure his killers face that same law. The territorial judge, a veteran of countless trials, found himself struck by the contrast between Sarah's quiet dignity and the devastating effectiveness of her vengeance. When he sentenced James Kincaid to hang, the condemned man seemed almost relieved. Death, perhaps, was preferable to living with the knowledge that he'd been outmaneuvered so completely by the widow he'd thought to terrorize. In town, changes were already becoming apparent. Rebecca Cooper noticed more families moving to Shadow Creek, drawn by its newfound reputation for safety. Dr. Wilson's practice grew as the town expanded, though she still made time for regular tea with Sarah. The two women had formed a bond that went beyond friendship. They were both pioneers in their own way, breaking the territory's expectations of what a woman could be. Young Billy, true to Sarah's faith in him, took to deputy work with surprising aptitude. Under Sheriff Bradley's guidance, he became living proof that redemption was possible, even in the harsh reality of the frontier. His knowledge of outlaw ways proved invaluable in preventing other gangs from getting any ideas about Shadow Creek. Sarah herself settled back into her quiet routine, though subtle differences emerged. She still baked pies and tended her apple trees, but now she also helped train the town's defenders. Her shooting lessons became legendary, drawing students from as far as Santa Fe. Yet she never lost that gentle manner that had first endeared her to the town, making her perhaps even more intimidating, a woman who could serve tea and deal death with equal grace. "You've changed this place," Sheriff Bradley told her one evening, sharing coffee on her porch. "Not just made it safer, but given it something to believe in." Sarah watched the sunset paint her apple blossoms gold, one hand absently touching the ring at her throat. Thomas used to say that civilization needs two things to flourish: good people willing to live in peace, and stronger people willing to defend that peace. She smiled softly. Shadow Creek has both now. The town's children started calling her Aunt Sarah, bringing her flowers and begging for stories she rarely told. But the adults noticed how she watched over their young ones, how her keen eyes still tracked strangers passing through, how her hands never strayed far from those deadly Colts when trouble threatened. As autumn approached, bringing with it the first harvest from her revitalized orchard, Sarah received a letter that made her smile. The territorial governor, impressed by Shadow Creek's transformation, was considering making it a regional headquarters for the newly expanded ranges. "Seems fitting," Dr. Wilson commented over tea. A town that started hiding from its troubles, now becoming a beacon of law and order. Sarah poured another cup with her usual precise grace. "Every place has the potential for either darkness or light," she replied. "It just needs someone willing to stand against the shadow." 5 years after the Kincaid gang's defeat, Shadow Creek had grown into something its original settlers could scarcely have imagined. The railroad had come, bringing with it new opportunities and challenges. But through it all, Sarah McPherson remained its quiet guardian, her legend growing, even as she seemed to fade into the backdrop of daily life. The morning James Kincaid met his fate in Kansas, Sarah stood in the crowd, watching justice finally complete its circle. His last words were directed at her. "You won, Angel Eyes. The devil himself must fear a woman's vengeance." She didn't reply, simply watched with those haunting blue eyes until the trap dropped and her husband's last killer paid his debt. Back in Shadow Creek, she continued her dual life, the gentle widow serving pie at church socials, and the deadly enforcer whose very name made outlaws choose easier targets. Young Billy, now a full deputy with his own reputation for fairness, often sought her advice. "How do you live with it?" he asked one evening, troubled after his first killing in the line of duty. "The weight of the lives you've taken?" Sarah's answer was characteristically thoughtful. "You don't live with it, Billy. You live despite it. Every life I took was a choice between evil prospering or justice prevailing. Thomas taught me that the real burden isn't in the killing, it's in making sure each death serves the cause of right." The territorial governor himself came to Shadow Creek to establish the Rangers' headquarters and found himself sharing tea with the legendary Angel Eyes. He later wrote in his journal, "Never have I met someone who embodies so perfectly the contradiction of the frontier, gentle as spring rain, deadly as a desert storm. She is what this territory needs. Proof that civilization doesn't mean weakness." Dr. Wilson and Rebecca Cooper remained her closest friends, the three women forming a core of quiet strength that helped guide the town's growth. They were there the day Sarah finally took off her wedding ring, though the chain remained around her neck. "Thomas will always be part of me," she explained. "But I think he'd want me to remember I'm living, not just avenging." Her apple orchard flourished, becoming famous throughout the territory. People said there was something special about fruit grown in soil that had absorbed so much history. Sarah would smile at such talk, though those who knew her best caught the flicker of remembrance in her eyes, memories of other orchards, other times, when she was just a lawman's wife with no inkling of the legend she would become. The stories about her continued to grow. Mothers told their daughters about the widow who refused to be a victim, who turned her grief into a force for justice. Men spoke of her in saloons with a mixture of fear and respect, but in Shadow Creek she was simply Sarah, their protector, their conscience, their living reminder that one person with enough determination could stand against the darkness and win. As she aged, her aim never wavered, her eyes never lost their piercing quality. Young guns sometimes rode into town, hoping to make a name by challenging the legend. They usually left quietly after one look into those angel eyes, understanding that some legends are best left unchallenged. "You've given us something rare," Sheriff Bradley told her on the 10th anniversary of the Kincaid gang's defeat. "Not just safety, but pride in being part of something bigger than ourselves." Sarah stood in her orchard, watching children play beneath the apple trees that had once provided cover for her greatest battle. Thomas used to say that a community is only as strong as its willingness to defend what's right. She smiled, touched the chain at her throat. "I think he'd be proud of what Shadow Creek has become." The legend of Angel Eyes became part of the territory's folklore, a story of love, loss, vengeance, and ultimately redemption. But in Shadow Creek, they knew the truth was both simpler and more profound. Sometimes the most dangerous thing on the frontier isn't the person who looks fierce, but the quiet widow serving tea and pie, watching you with eyes that can see into your very soul. If you enjoyed this story of justice served with a side of apple pie, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We've got plenty more tales of the Old West coming your way, each one as unique as Sarah McPherson herself.